Good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming today. We contemplated doing a champagne breakfast, but figured you'd all be completely Christmas partied out. I think at last stage I had 12 union Christmas parties to go to, and I imagine there's lots of people in this room that are the same. It's lovely to see so many faces here from my kind of 2 decades of working in and for the union movement. And by way of introduction, I'm Alex Grayson and I head up the employment industrial team at Maurice Blackburn. So lovely to see you all. So it's going to be really interesting this morning because I got online this morning thinking, what the hell is organised disruption? And I actually think I'm none the wiser having spent that time on my iPhone Googling this morning. So I think we're in for a real treat this morning because I think what we're going to see is 2 very and hopefully different perspectives on what organised disruption is. So we're hearing from Tony Sheldon, union official extraordinaire, and we're hearing from Mark Carnegie, venture capitalist extraordinaire, who I usually see down the other end of the board table in my role as a host plus trustee. So it'll be very interesting for me today, and I think interesting for you all. So I hope by the end of today we're all kind of better educated, better informed, energised. I think there's going to be some really interesting perhaps suggestions on interesting things, especially for the union officials in the room. So thank you for coming. Thank you to Capita for allowing us to host this non-champagne breakfast. And particularly thanks for the support staff, Demi and Tennille, who have worked very hard, and many others who maybe I haven't named, to make this happen today. So thank you very much. Enjoy. I'll hand over to Mark.
I think the idea that I'm introducing Tony to you is slightly sort of messed up. You know him a lot better than I did. The reason that I ended up here when I heard that I could have a conversation with Tony about the Uberization of the world was that I get to see a lot of people in the technology business, businessmen, politicians, all sorts of different people. But the truth of the matter is the most interesting conversation I had about what were we going to do about the waves that are crashing upon my head happened at a lunch that I had with Tony about Qantas when we were sitting there trying to agitate for change, and we needed to find a way to try and recruit the union movement to help us, and as a consequence of the fact that we hadn't met each other before and there was some other guy who was another sort of businessman, it all ended up in a giant mess, not working particularly well for Tony and not working well for us. But I always thought, in the lunch that I had with Tony, the issues of what was going on in Australia and in fact the world as a consequence of technological change and globalisation, and in fact the whole growth of superannuation, was better understood by him than anybody I'd seen. And I mean that. The politicians have a really narrow view about what can we do in a tactical sense within the election cycle to try and find a way to get a better outcome if they're on the good guys' side. But it's incredibly boxed. And business people, by and large, take a view that says, hey, all that needs to happen is for us to turn from a high-wage economy to a low-wage economy, and everything, the sun is going to shine again. Well, the fact is you're not going to be able to solve it within a 3-year election cycle, any of the trends we're talking about at the moment. And in fact, the fact that Australia is a high-wage economy and a constructive hybrid, in my way of thinking, between the Scandinavians and the Americans is really the thing that saved us and avoided Australia tearing the social fabric apart in the way that the US and I think the UK is as well. Now, I had only a very brief conversation with Tony about all these things, but I look forward to trying to do it again today, because I think the question of what is going to be countervailing power for the next 100 years is completely and utterly unsettled law. People talk a lot about Piketty's book, about growing inequality, about all of these other things. But when you look at Piketty's suggestions about what he does, not only are they politically impractical, they're just not going to work either. So the whole question about what we're going to do remains as a sort of existential question for the society, and an important one. And as I've said before, inequality matters not just for the poorest people in the society, but for everyone, because more equal societies are better for everyone. So part of the conversation is going to be about that. The other part that you can pick up in Piketty's book is that our superannuation does a lot of what he suggests needs to be rectified about capitalism. But I don't think the union movement has really thought properly about how they're going to find some way to think about that. They're so scared that power is going to get taken away from them that at no level have they been able to constructively engage with how affirmatively they can use superannuation and the fact that this is worker capitalism in an intelligent way. So I think that's, again, completely and utterly white space. And the final thing that I think I'd say before introducing Tony is this is what happened in the scale of what is happening in the world at the moment has its precedent in the early 1800s, where the Industrial Revolution meant that the aggregates in the economy grew massively, but the migration from the country to the cities meant that median life experience went backwards for nearly 50 years in a whole series of places before coherent sense of countervailing power came together, doing the trust busting with the union movement and with a whole series of things that meant, like Teddy Roosevelt introducing the national parks as well. And half the world went down a path of a collectivist experiment in the face of these trends that ended up as a disaster as well. So to understate the importance of the discussion that Tony's going to kick off today is to sadly understate the impact and the size of the changes that are going on in the world economy. So without further ado, over to you, mate.
Thanks, Mark. Good, thanks very much, Mark, and certainly thank you to the Capita and Maurice Blackburn for this opportunity this morning. So good morning, everybody, and it's nice to be here with you all, and of course thank you all for joining us today to discuss what is a very important issue about the digital disruption and what I think we should appropriately call the Uberization of jobs. I want to start with a real-life example that illustrates the conundrum we're facing. Michael Hattrick, a very good friend of mine and known for many years, has joined us today. He's kind enough to spend his time with us too. As a taxi driver, Michael's held a licence since 1979. He knows the industry has faced its fair share of problems over a number of years. But Uber is nothing like he's ever seen before. Since it took over 18 months ago, his income has dropped 20%. Not only are taxi drivers struggling financially, but there are huge safety implications. Drivers are having to work longer hours, in some cases 7 days a week, to meet the shortfall in income. Meanwhile, Uber drivers are working part-time to supplement full-time bills, or they're investing in their business, including with their labour, to generate constant returns required to seek a fair wage and conditions, and to provide well-maintained vehicles, whilst Uber has unilaterally decreased rates to drivers by 10%. This means that drivers are more fatigued and more likely to have accidents. Michael is adamant this is not the way to go. But that's the things that look like, and also the things certainly look like they're going to get a great deal worse. And I certainly agree with Michael's analysis. This is the story of someone whose life and work has been disrupted by technological change. And I commend Michael for the bravery of coming today. To many of us, Michael's story might sound like the sad experience of a small minority. Those who have lost their livelihoods to technological change, perhaps the inevitable cost of progress. But Michael's story is far more widespread than you think. Over and over, the story repeats for men and women across Australia, spreading to the farthest corners of our economy. But we all know about the Uber displacing taxi drivers, and I'll say more about that later. But look further and you'll see digital disruption everywhere. Large parts of our manufacturing sector have been already packed off to Asia due to lower labour costs and trade agreements. But now global manufacturing is under threat from 3D printing, which can make anything from a prosthetic arm to a jet engine. Artificial intelligence is expanding through the Internet of Things, which allows machines to diagnose their own servicing needs and download software patches to fix them, doing away with traditional servicing jobs. Now, this confirms a trend that old-fashioned car mechanics have been telling us for a while now: the digitisation of machines, which makes the man with the wrench much, much less relevant. And despite these changes, many of us still feel our jobs are safe. Well, if you want to put the theory to the test, you should visit a neat little app on the BBC website. You type in your job title, and it tells you the likelihood that your job will be automated and whether it will be automated in the next 20 years. Now, if you manage a hairdressing salon, you're a hairdresser, good news. You only have a 25% chance that your job will disappear in the next 2 decades. Now, hang on, let's just have a look what happens if you're an accountant. You'll see this illustration. Hopefully. Type it in. And you'll see the figure come up. For an accountant, you have a 95% likelihood that your job won't exist by 2035. In all, the app tells us that 35% of all UK jobs are at high risk of disappearing over the next 20 years. Of course, it's easy to pick out a few select examples. But what do we know about the aggregate impacts of digital disruption on the labour market? We know that wages have been stagnant in Australia since the terms of trade peaked in 2011, and have been flat in other rich countries for much longer than that. Of course, 40 years in the United States. But what does a longer sweep of history tell us about the impact of massive technology shocks on the fortunes of the community? At the Trade Union Congress in London last month, Andy Halliday, Chief Economist of the Bank of England, summarised his research of several hundred years of technological disruption, punctuated by 3 distinct economic revolutions. The first industrial revolution began with steam engines and spinning jennies in the middle of the 18th century. The second, the era of mass industrialisation, sprung up in northern England in the second half of the 19th century. And of course, the information technology revolution, which began in the last 20th century. It's possible that the onset of robotics and artificial intelligence will constitute the fourth revolution and will be upon us within 20 years. Haldane observes there is a remarkable consistency in the effects of these shifts. In the long term, these revolutions put together deliver 3 positive legacies. Average incomes grow strongly, thanks to growing labour productivity. Overall rates of employment remain steady, and hours worked per week fall. Although not to the level, of course, of the 15 hours a week that was predicted by Keynes that his grandchildren would enjoy, or the 3 hours a week that the Jetsons predicted in the 1960s. So this is the good news. There is change. These revolutions can deliver rises in living standards without reducing overall employment rates. But of course, there is the bad news. There is the news that's hidden amongst these findings too. Haldane notes these numbers, of course, are all averages. They describe what happened at an aggregate level, but don't tell you much about the distribution of income gains. For while the revolutions lifted overall incomes, they each exhibited a strong hollowing out of middle income jobs. There were more new high-flying paying jobs and more new low-paying jobs. But jobs in the middle of the income distribution disappeared. Put very simply, each of these massive technological revolutions have made inequality worse. Recent data from the IMF and ACOS confirm this is exactly what's happening in Australia and around the developed world. This is the great challenge of digital disruption. How do we capture the benefits of higher productivity, higher income, and less working time, but avoid the worsening inequality that previous technological revolutions have wrought? So I say that we can meet this challenge in two ways. Of course, we can go down the low road. A community disaster with millions upon millions of Australians like Michael who see their livelihoods disappear from under them. That's effectively digital work choices. Or we can take the high road, harnessing innovation in a way that spreads prosperity. And of course, self-evidently, many of us here, all of us here, want to see the high road approach taken. Of course, perhaps the most important step is to balance market power across society, across employees, contractors, small and big business, and to retain a strong safety net for those displaced by technology. This requires not just a set of minimum rights, but the renewed application of community values across markets. Individual rights must be balanced with community ones. Much of our public debate, of course, focuses on the freedoms of business to organise as it sees fit, or the freedoms of self-employed contractors to negotiate their own conditions. But we mustn't forget the freedoms of the community to enjoy birthday parties, or local footy grand finals, or school working bees. And of course, the second key component is the retention of a strong social safety net. We know that some disruption from the current digital revolution is inevitable. Some people will be left behind. But for those people, it's critical that we retain a decent pension, New Start payments that allow recipients to make ends meet while they look for work, universal free healthcare for those who can't afford it, and comprehensive superannuation policies that mean workers can accumulate savings no matter what their employment situation. Now, what brings us to a third aspect of our high road approach is how do we pay for the strong social safety net? This, of course, requires a reasonable contribution on the part of companies that are profiting so much from the digital revolution. In the worst cases, these companies and their apps are ripping through the economy while ripping through communities and ripping them apart. Disruptive firms need to be accountable for the labour markets and supply chains they create and the impact on these on our communities. Or, as it was succinctly put in a Guardian headline this week, algorithm writers need a code of conduct. One obvious way for them to do this is to pay for their fair share of tax in a very transparent way. In 2014, Google paid $11.7 million of company tax in Australia, despite earning over $2 billion of income through local advertising on its search engine business. Conveniently, it books this income into low-tax Singapore. This kind of behaviour must stop. If we are to balance the benefits and costs of the digital revolution across the community, we have to act. The Senate has been doing a great job in uncovering some of the worst excesses. So it was disappointing to see the Greens join with the government last week to extend the shield that allows large private companies to hide these accounts, and thus their accountability. Another area where entrepreneurs could do better is in life experience and diversity. Now take a look at this slide. Friendly faces, yes. What do you notice? Geeks, yes. Men, all white, and largely under the age of 30. Now, these people have made their own luck, and definitely hats off to them. But it's concerning that a tiny, homogenous group of people have such an impact on the working conditions of millions upon millions of people without accountability. Disruption in isolation is no good. If it doesn't benefit society more broadly, and you have to ask whether these guys have the life experience to inform big judgments that affect so many people here and in our communities. Now let's come back to basics. It's pretty simple. Disruptive technology companies need to be good corporate citizens. They need to think through the consequences of their innovations on the labour markets they disrupt, and work with employees, contractors, and governments to ensure a framework for decent pay, rights and conditions, and a better community. I'd put this to all of us. Who is the party who can work with the innovators to deliver this framework? Of course, it won't surprise when I say it's Labor, the national political party, that does have at its heart the desire to balance market power across society, to balance individual rights with community interests, to balance the needs of workers, contractors, and small and big business. Now, a new Conservative Prime Minister needs to be congratulated, Mr. Turnbull. He's talked lots about the exciting times that we live in and the potential of innovation. But so far, his policies are more of the same and contain nothing about ensuring the benefits of the digital revolution are spread fairly. If we went back to the geeks photo, you would see again who he envisages as sharing the great advantage of a digital society. Now, Labor is the party that should be striking the right balance of interests across the economy and society. Bill Shorten has made a good head start just recently, and I think well ahead of Malcolm Turnbull in this regard. Labor struck this balance in the 1940s under Chifley and Curtin, and in the 1980s under Hawke and Keating. But in 2015, Labor needs to be leading from the front again. The innovation plan released last week by Ed Husick says basically nothing about helping workers displaced by disruption, for whom new skills are just an option. Chris Bowen's recent contributions to the economic debate argue that the company tax should be cut, hardly Labor and hardly innovative. Maybe Labor needs to listen harder to its next generation, Andrew Lee on inequality, or Terry Butler on employee share ownership, or Jim Chalmers on small business. Because there are solutions out there. You can find my own circumstances and many of us here with safe rates with the Labor government. They showed they could balance the interests of drivers, companies, consumers, and other road users. Presently, the TWU is consulting with workplace leaders across the aviation industry to pursue a basic income alongside traditional rights in all of our industrial agreements. This is an industry worth $81 billion to the economy. Surely it can pay its workers a basic income. This approach is driven out of the need to provide basic income, but it also can't be just about more hours. As work hours are reducing, we need to keep wage rates higher in order to provide a basic income. You can't have a part-time job to pay full-time bills. Here are some insights from a couple of TWU members explaining exactly this challenge. Billy McGlue was a part-time worker at QGS in Perth Airport, says this: they introduced 4-hour shifts, which is ridiculous. We sometimes have to work 2 weeks of 4-hour shifts, and people cannot afford to pay their bills with wages like that. Qantas is trying to make their workforce a third world workforce. It's quoted. Asher Walter, a part-time worker at QGS in Sydney Airport. My partner and I want to start a family soon, but it's hard. I'm only part-time, while she earns more money than me in a full-time job. If she has to leave the workforce, even for a short while, we just won't be able to pay the bills or rent. I'm unhappy with the conditions at the moment. We're struggling whilst Qantas are posting massive profits. They say they can't pass that on to us in a form that's going to actually help us. These stories illustrate a very simple proposition. To have a good civil society, you need a basic income. In this context, it's interesting that the idea of universal basic income provided by the state is gaining ground in several developed economies. Switzerland is holding a referendum on a basic income for every citizen. Finland is finalising plans to introduce it nationwide next year. And from next month, the Dutch city of Utrecht will pay a trial group of adults €900 per single and €1,350 per couple. What's notable is that it looks like the politics of both the right and the left might be aligning around this option. And of course, other ideas are in the pipeline too, albeit a bit further off. We should be thinking about extending domestic violence leave to the entire community, yes, and absolutely. But we should also be including over 1 million contractors who will not get options or opportunity to that leave. Over 1 million contractors and growing. We need to think about how to structure the Uber payment so that some share of booking fees goes to annual and sick leave, and another share goes to the driver's superannuation to allow dignity in retirement. Of course, these are big implications in the role for unions. We have to organise, we have to communicate, and we have to negotiate. And how we ask our governments to regulate and how we allow our communities to have a voice. But I'll leave these thoughts for a separate speech in the new year, because they're critically important points about the voice of gaining community value. But right now, I hope we can have some good discussions with Mark and David. We're looking forward to questions from all of you in the audience and comments, and how we might all together tackle the digital revolution.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Mark. My name is David Hetherington. I'm the Executive Director of Capita, and I'm just going to facilitate a brief, but no doubt interrogative question and answer session with these guys from you. So feel free to pepper Tony and Mark with questions. I might kick off by asking about something that I don't think either of you mentioned, and it's education. There's a professor at Harvard, Danny Katz, who says that the inequality result is about a contest between education on the one hand and technology on the other. And if technology is going quicker than we're educating people, inequality will get worse. And it seems to me at the moment that technology is moving as quickly as any of us have ever known, and education may struggle to keep up. So I just wanted to take your views on whether skills can.
So the first thing is, I think just struggling with all of this is like trying to eat a bowling ball. And the whole issue about opportunity and the legitimacy of our system without fair and equal opportunity is a huge, huge problem. And when you look at all of the numbers about access to tertiary education, how important that is as being a participant in the new economy, and the fact that we've just cut education as a percent of GDP in terms of expenditure and stuff like that, we've clearly got a huge problem there. The problem is that would take the questions about what to do about education, access, equality of opportunity, social latency or whatever is a discussion on its own. I think the question today on Uberization, how do you organise a society when jobs are now part of the gig economy, is the sort of jargon word for it, is another component. On education and opportunity, do I believe you can fix that? Absolutely. Do I think you're going to fix it by cutting education spending as a percent of GDP? No, I don't. And I just final thing I'd say is, I also think as I watch it closer and closer, I'd have to say that I don't think either organised teachers or universities are doing a particularly good job of actually sitting there and serving their customers, or particularly well in these circumstances. So I don't feel like you get a huge amount of help from them about here's how we can take advantage of technology to get better outcomes, to allow the opportunity for the people who come and need to be served by us. Sorry, long speech.
That's good. I agree and disagree with some aspects of what I've said. I think I certainly agree with the question about what we do about incomes, because if you break it down, it's always try to take it to the personal. I'm just about to purchase a $2,700 Mac Pro for my daughter because that's what the school requires, and my daughter goes to a local Catholic school. I don't know how the bulk of the kids their parents can possibly afford it. I'm lucky enough between myself and my ex-wife to be able to afford it, not without some considerable cost. But how does the rest of the community actually afford to have a proper education, particularly in the digital age? What's the economic drivers on that relationship? And I agree to disagree on the education side, Mark. I get amazed every time I meet up with teachers, whether it be for merits or demerits for my son or merits for my daughter. But the amount of work that actually goes into comparison when I was at school, I'm just blown away. But I also get blown away with the lack of support that exists with the new economy and what the expectations are on our kids. So I think there's a need for a heck of a lot more investment and a heck of a lot more services within the teaching profession. But also there has to be the capacity where we have the capacity ourselves to also contribute to that through a decent income. That's what makes the law go around, and I think it's critical.
Hey, did anyone? There's a hand up there. Yeah.
David Hetherington here from Organised Lawyers. I was just, it struck me that the sharing economy and a lot of these ride-sharing apps like Uber, they effectively are almost a structure of cooperatives, in the sense that workers own the capital, the car, they own their own car. So basically the app is just a mediator or an way of organising it. I'm just wondering, I noticed that the US unions, or some of the US unions, Communication Workers Union, they're creating or funding co-ops with ride-sharing apps for drivers. I'm just wondering if framing it like independent contractors versus employment is perhaps the wrong way to frame it, and that maybe the unions are missing out on an opportunity here to sort of redefine what workers are and workers' power and control. Just wondering if that was part of the conversation.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one thing is I wouldn't call it sharing economy. I'd call it on-demand economy. And then that very important example you used of the communication workers in comparison with Uber, and you break down what the processes are. The communications workers, and there's a number of others that have actually said, here are rights, here is basic incomes, here is a voice. Here's a community collective nature. Then you go to Uber. They can take you off your system whenever they like. They've, in the last 12 months in most countries, they've reduced the payments they've made to drivers that have taken the entire risk of investing in the vehicle. That they've reduced unilaterally their incomes by 10 to 20%, with no reduction in cost to consumers, but that's also just a side interest, important interest, but side interest. So, and then you look at a number of unions, and I include my own because we're actually commenced by owner-operators. We are the largest small business organisation in the country by far. And I'd suggest we're bigger than every other small business organisation put together. So we have close to 20,000 owner-operators and many more that receive benefits from what we collectively, our members do. So it's not about, I agree about that point. It should not be seen as an anti. It should be seen as how do you empower contractors' rights, not how you make a contractor an employee. That's my view. And that's my experience with dealing with collective groups of contractors. The question I think it raised, and that is that if you're a contractor who's been working for Uber or Uberized, what happens when you're taking all the risk? All the risk is on you. You have no say. You have no voice. It is not a cooperative because you're terminated at Uber's whim, and your wages, conditions, and rights are exploited at Uber's whim. So there isn't an equal, almost cooperatives suggest a degree of collective equality. That's not Uber.
Mike, did you want anything
No.
to add? No. It strikes me that there's a reasonably basic principle here. Anyone who works for an income, who effectively sells their labour for work, should be entitled to decent paying conditions, irrespective of the specific employment chain that leads the cash to run their pocket in exchange for labour. And clearly those structures are fragmenting very quickly. And the question is, how do we underpin all that with a kind of framework of decent paying conditions and rights and voice? It's clearly challenging. Now, so another hand there. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Peter Lewis from Essential. I started thinking about Uber when another think tank earlier this year brought out a guy called David Hetherington, who was one of the high up Uber execs, and he'd been one of Obama's main, everyone's one of Obama's main, he was one of Obama's main guys apparently. And they filled the Great Hall at Sydney with the collective left, glitterati of Sydney, and then he got up and started prophetising about this idea that in any city in the world, I can create 20,000 jobs, and guess what? You don't even need to work a whole day, you can work whenever you want. It struck me, the left was embracing this model of a new economy because it seemed new and shiny, but it wasn't really a job. It was something that was far more 18th century. And I guess my question is, how have they made that cool and progressive? And how have we left the idea of workers' rights, I guess I'm as much to blame as anyone, as being old and dusty? And how do you shift that? Because in a way this is consumer driven, and Uber is cool and taxis are old. A share economy is cool, old unionism is old. And how you switch that, I'm not sure the answer, but I'm interested in your perspectives, Tony.
Just to do a little bit of anecdote, also one of my roles is I'm chair of the road section in the National Transport Federation, so we're dealing with the Uber issue around the world amongst many other issues. And I wouldn't say we're negotiating with Uber, we're having discussions with Uber, and one of the few in Australia and one of the few countries that are in that position. And when Uber executives sit down with you and say, oh look, at some point, like drivers will be able to pick up passengers in the afternoon, pick up parcels during the day, pick up passengers in the morning, parcels in the day, passengers in the afternoon. And then if they want to, they can even deliver pizzas at night. It's pretty damn exciting. You can do that every day, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. You never have to worry about seeing your kids. You never have to worry about putting enough money aside because in actual fact, you decide what they get paid and what percentage of the income that you charge to consumers. He said, oh no, actually drivers will have a right ultimately to be able to compare which on-demand company they work for at any given time, at any given point. Now that comes back to a very important point you just raised. That'll be a consumer-led system of the lowest rate, the lowest pay. And how do you make the people that are making all the money, the economic employer, accountable for that? So there is an economic employment responsibility or economic contractor in that supply chain who has the power that should be accountable for that, not just the one who reaps the bucks and rips the community apart. And I bring back to that point I said before, we rightly as a community are leading the world about domestic violence rights in workplaces. And it's now very broad. Over 2 million workers now have those rights. If you're a contractor, that, along with many other rights, you do not have. Is that building a better society? And I put that to our Uber people and explain to them that you have an opportunity to create a decent society, one that's balanced, innovative, and uses the app to give a better service, or it's one that actually exploits and destroys communities. And your choice is yours, but the argument's going to be from us to say that shouldn't happen.
Down the front here, Laurie.
I'm going to stand up here because otherwise people can't see me. I have to apologise. I can speak till lunchtime without drawing breath on this. So very quickly, Internet Australia is the organisation I'm with, and we have called for a bipartisan digital future forum to get the government and the opposition together to see if we can't work out how to be smarter. Uber is a very simple example, and with greatest of respect, the reason Uber is working is because people don't like taxis. So there's a solution to that, and this is I think how we've got to smart and think of different ways of doing things. So I use GoCatch, I use taxis, but GoCatch is an app. So what we've got to do is we've got to find ways to use technology to create jobs, not to displace jobs.
Is there a question for either of the
Yes,
two?
sorry, the question was, what is the union movement doing about how do you interact with a workforce which isn't in a place where you can send an organiser out? You can still unionise. You just got to use technology.
There's another. I totally agree. The technology is part of the answer. I wish I had the recipe, because otherwise we'd be now using it across the movement. We'd be all sharing it. But the answer is creative, and the answer is there. I agree. I think there's a real capacity to do it. In actual fact, there's a capacity to do it in traditional jobs, let alone new jobs in the economy. And I think that's one of the areas that the ACTU, to their credit, have had a digital disruption conference only a matter of weeks ago.
We spoke at it.
It was fantastic, and it was really challenging from a broad cross section, as you're aware, a broad cross section of people coming in different perspectives, but also saying how we do build a better society at this great opportunity. I'm not a pessimist about this. I actually think that this disruption, I'm also not a Marxist either, but I also think this disruption actually gives us an opportunity to actually build a better society. And I think it's a question of whether the opinion makers and the drivers are prepared to be, one, held to account, but most importantly, whether we're collectively prepared to pursue it.
Thanks, Mr. Zielinski, Australian Workers Union, also from CBUS Super. I've just got a question picking up on your initial remarks about super funds, workers' capital. One thing I'm quite bullish about from a industry super fund perspective is investing in innovation. We're starting to see some of that with First State host spots investing in Blackburn, etc. I was curious about what I think first is one strategy is at least be capturing what are the value, the shareholder value for workers, but you sort of touched on some other strategies that you had. I'm just curious to hear what those are, because without risking, I suppose, the reputations of the funds, trying to lead companies to act ethically or whatever, and also the political risks associated with ESG type strategies.
Yeah, I spoke about this earlier in the week in a completely different forum, which was the company directors conference, where I said, look, we've got a system that's really broken at the moment. People don't want to admit it. Ultimately, the single thing that's going to drive everything is productivity. And it drives it in all sorts of different directions. I won't go into all of them other than to say, ultimately, the outcome for people's superannuation is going to be down to GDP growth, and especially GDP growth per person over a long period of time. If you go even further, you think about the average person who doesn't want to think about their superannuation, and any discussion they have with their financial advisor or financial planner is sort of line ball with root canal as a pleasant experience. But a sensible discussion about what they're trying to do, which is maximise their financial security when they retire 20 years hence. That's a reasonably easy thing to understand. So just hold the thought of what the bulk of the owners of Australian shares want. It's not about ESG or, everyone's nice or workplace or all that other crap. It's ultimately, I want to be safe to live when I can't work anymore. Yeah. So there's a whole lot of other things that might be socially good, but for that guy who owns most of the shares in Australia or girl, it's clear what they want. That's a 10 to 20 year story. Turn that around to think about the obligation. I'm sorry this is a long answer, but I feel passionate about it. A director has a sort of complicated set of objectives. But if their objective was 7 to 10 year, either absolute return on the shares or outperformance of the share market or outperformance of the peer group, it'd be reasonably easy to understand as a director what you were trying to do, which is your job when you become a director is to make the company more valuable in 7 to 10 years than now. Yeah. The obligation on directors is not that. It's to act in the best interest of the company, which is a sort of tomato sauce phrase that means whatever you want it to mean. It can be poured on anything. So I think actually finding some way to, and that was why I found the conversation with Tony much more interesting, was what workers want from superannuation is relatively clear, which is long-term solid performance of companies. Yeah. And narrowing the obligation and the responsibility of directors would help them to achieve that. As I say, I sit on boards, I try and sit on as few as I can, because by the time you've had this committee and that committee and the other committee, I'm famous for saying, you need a when are we making some bloody money committee to actually spend any time in a board meeting concentrating on what you're meant to be doing. Yeah. Then what happens is 16 layers of bloody consultants and fuckwits of all sorts, right? And you're snowblind about what you're meant to do, and then you're scared shitless that somebody's going to take your house away because you pricks at Maurice Blackburn are going to class action you. By the end, the thing is just absolutely and utterly chaotic. Yeah. But you're the guys who are meant to be rethinking capitalism, right? And it's not about leaning on them to be better corporate citizens or anything like that. It's like you got him and his superannuation, It's like, what are you going to do to actually improve the performance? And the second part is people just aren't going to diversify internationally. It's about the Australian share market. And the Australian share market is about making the Australian economy work as well, yeah? And so making it work in this environment all connects to each other. So issues over, Tony and I were talking about shareholder activism. You guys have got money in my venture capital funds, all of that, all really, really interesting. But I think simplifying and shortening the chain between him and his super and what he cares about, right? And directors, and especially the public market, is really, really going to help a lot.
We've probably got time for one more question. I saw a hand to the back. Yes.
Good morning, Julia Featherstone from the Boston Consulting Group. So I lead our work on the future of education and the future of life in collaboration with CSIRO. So my question for you both is about the role of government here. So to get to this kind of innovative, high quality, high labor and high technology productivity economy, what should the government be prioritizing, given that they have, there's going to be a huge regulatory component, probably a big taxation reform component, probably like a big chunk of education and infrastructure investment. Over the next, say, 5 years, what do they have to think about and then do first?
UBI, I think. If you're looking for one shot, what's going to do it? In the end, you just can't play in the gig economy without some sort of security. You look at all of the 67 other things, you can see how that's actually going to allow you to put ante every round of table stakes capitalism. There's 1,000 other things, and I can go in millions of other directions, and we go back in. But ultimately,
I don't think you get to play that game without that, my view.
I think you have to have a really clear purpose about where you want to be in 20 years. You say like, what do you do as the first step? The first step is say where you want to be in 20 years and what you want the community to look like, and what values do you want to be striving for. So, and if the community's going to be looking at substantially, less capacity to work, as it stands at the moment, where it could go, you want to argue where you want it to go. Then the important piece that Mark just said, but also all the other pieces then start fitting into one framework. And the great difficulty is that we've got a whole series of policy initiatives that are separate and have a lack of focus about where we're heading. And I think I'm not a great fan of theirs, but even these summits that are being held by AFR. I mean, one of the positive things is that there is a conversation about all the pieces that need to take place. What isn't quite being said because of the diversity of politics in the room, ideologies, that where do we want to be? That's really important. And talking about and I think your point before about the conversation between government, civil society, and broad society and community is where we want to be. That then drives those policy decisions.
But we want to stay on top and stay fair.
Yeah.
So if you want to stay on top and stay fair, how are you going to do it when essentially everybody's working part-time and there's a giant reverse auction for labour going on in the world? And the answer is a civil society needs to find some way to provide a civil safety net, and it needs to provide, jargon word coming, optionality for people.
Stay on top and stay fair. I think it's a pretty good note to wrap up on. We committed to get you out of here as close to 9:30 as we could, so we'll do that. Of course, there are some thanks to be shared to Alex and your colleagues at Maurice Blackburn. Thank you very much for hosting us this morning. I won't use the we've had events like this without you guys, so we are very grateful. To both of our speakers, thank you for coming on. We've got a small Christmas thank you gift to each of you. There you are. Delighted that you could share your insights with us. I do want to make a brief plug of Per Capita's membership. For a modest two-figure sum, you can become a member for a year and help us do more and more events like this. It's a great Christmas present if you're thinking about what your progressive friends and family might like under the tree. So really do think about it. It's worthwhile and it helps us keep these conversations going. But finally, thank you to all of you for coming along. I know December's a very busy time. Friday morning's not easy to squeeze something in. So we hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you in the new year. Cheers.